Everyone, and welcome to AARDA's second webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just a few quick notes before we get to the good stuff. Everything is being recorded, and if you registered, we will be sending you all the contents of the presentation, so please don't worry about taking any notes. We will be sending it all to you in the coming days. My name is Katie. I'm the project manager for AARDA, and helping me out today is Sandra, and Laura will be taking your questions and helping us with the chat. If you're running into any problems or anything, please just let Laura know. In order to be respectful of everyone's time, we ask that any questions be related to the subject of the webinar. But if you have anything else, please don't ever hesitate to email us at aarda@aarda.org. Our featured speaker tonight is the incredible Lilly Stairs.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, sorry. We're trying to find her slide, but I don't think it's showing up. All right, but anyway, Lilly is an amazing advocate for autoimmune disease patients. She's been with AARDA for a few years now as a board member, and she's also the head of patient advocacy at Clara Health. I'm sure she'll do a much better job than I will talking about Clara and the amazing things that that organization does. But for now, we will just let her get started discussing clinical trials.
Thanks for the intro, Katie, and thanks to the AARDA team for inviting me on to take part in this webinar tonight. And welcome to all of our participants. We're so thrilled to have you on board and to learn more about clinical trials. They're such an important and critical piece of our healthcare ecosystem and so important for patients and caregivers to understand. And really at the core of what understanding clinical trials is this idea of self-advocacy and the idea of getting yourself the best possible care. And could we go to the next slide, please? Are we able to? Oh, there we go. So being your own best advocate is really critical when you're living with an autoimmune disease. And if you're tuning into this, you probably know that. It can be really stressful to try to manage care. Oftentimes you're seeing multiple specialists, and so you have to take charge of your own care. And there are many different resources out there to be aware of. And of course, at the center of that is your care team. So your doctors and your nurses. And then there's the interwebs, which online research can be both a blessing and a curse. I think there's so much out there that can be really, really valuable and where we can learn a lot, we can hear from other patients, but of course we then have to be careful about some of the things online that might not have validity to them or just being, anyone can post anything online. So it's just, you have to be careful about when you're searching where those sources are coming from. Fellow patients can be a great resource. They often can, they understand, they are in your shoes, they get what you're going through. And so they might be able to point out something and help you navigate your care. And then of course there's advocacy organizations like AARDA, which are a wonderful resource and can help on a number of different levels. And so I encourage you to, connect with AARDA, connect with patients to, to go on about your self-advocacy journey. And it's really important to remember that you own your care. You are at the center of this. You are the boss, you are the CEO of your care. And so make sure that when you are making decisions, you're practicing shared decision-making with your physician, meaning that your physician isn't just telling you a list of things to do and you do them. It's a conversation so that you will understand why you're doing those things. And if you don't feel comfortable with something, you have every right to push back or to seek a second opinion. There have been many times in my journey living with Crohn's disease and psoriatic arthritis that I've pushed back against my physician when they've said, we'd like to try adding this medication, or we'd like you to do this testing. And I said, well, I'd like to understand why you'd like to do that, because at this point I've done some of my own research and I don't think this is necessary. And so it's really, really important to do that, and don't be afraid to do that. Okay, I think we can head on to the next slide. Yeah, so, and again, so with autoimmune diseases, there are many that are rare. There are also many that currently have no specific medications or treatments. And it can be very challenging to find the right treatment plan for yourself. I'm sure that many of you listening have potentially tried many different medications that haven't worked. Some of you may have found the right fit, which is awesome if you have. But, and sometimes our bodies maybe build antibodies to a medication that works for a couple years, then it stops working. And so it's really important, for folks living with autoimmune diseases to understand all of the treatment options that are available to you. And that includes clinical trials. And, we say this because clinical trials are not really always a treatment option that gets discussed in an appointment. And that's not necessarily anyone's fault, but physicians, as we know, have 10 minutes or less to see patients. They're often double or triple booked, and you feel like you're just trying to get all of these questions in the short amount of time that you have. And so sometimes the idea of clinical trials can fall through the cracks, but they can really offer access to cutting edge therapies, and they can be a good fit for patients. And so it's important that, today we talk through it, and I'm hoping by the end of this webinar that you feel a lot more comfortable with the concept of clinical trials, and that you have you're empowered with this knowledge so that you have it, whether it be now or in the future, that you decide this could be something you want to explore. I think we can head into the next slide, which I believe is over to you, Katie.
So besides self-advocacy, which is incredibly important, AARDA, we also do political advocacy as well. If you're interested in that kind of thing, you can head on to our website. We work with a platform called Voter Voice. You type in all your information, and then when an advocacy issue pops up, we will email you with an action alert to contact your representatives to help support or not support a piece of legislation. And back to you, Lily.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, so clinical trials, what are they? And I think one of the big questions that we often get is are they safe? And so we're going to walk through talking about the different phases of the clinical trials, how they work, placebos, safety, all of these different components we're going to talk through in this webinar. And so let's jump right in. Katie, can we advance to the next slide, please? Okay, and clinical trials, what are they and what are they not? And so the first place we're going to actually kick this off is by talking about some examples of some of the different clinical trials that exist for autoimmune diseases. And I chose a sampling. So for reference here, there's almost 300,000 clinical trials that are currently running around the world, or well, just in the US actually. And so that's important to recognize that there's just so many options. So let's see, we only have 5 listed here, but I chose these because sometimes I think that we have this vision of clinical trials that we get from pop culture of these really weird medications that are being tested in patients that are totally experimental, but that's not really always the case. And so I wanted to talk about some examples of clinical trials that are really interesting and could offer really awesome treatment options for patients. And so one of them is this bioelectric therapy for rheumatoid arthritis. And this is actually something that it looks like it might be applicable to other autoimmune diseases, which we know is common. Oftentimes there will be a treatment that works for one autoimmune disease. Usually it's tested first in rheumatoid arthritis, and then it works its way into psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis and Crohn's disease and lupus. And so this is an example of that. And it's currently, it's going to be moving into a phase 2 clinical trial. And what it does is it's actually this little device that's about the size of a penny, and it gets implanted onto the vagus nerve, which is in the neck. And it automatically delivers electrical stimulation on a set schedule. And this kind of therapy can be used to trigger biochemical changes in the body, which usually happens via like a drug. And so that's really exciting to me as an autoimmune patient. I'm just like, yeah, I want a bioelectric therapy. And so I'm looking forward to when that, if and when that makes it into some of the indications that I'm living with. And so then there's also observational studies. And so there are a couple of autoimmune observational studies that I actually plugged into here. One is a pregnancy registry. There's something called the Piano study, which has just, it's thousands of women who contribute to it over time if they're on a biologic, and they give data while they are pregnant and breastfeeding to show what if and how biologics are impacting the baby. And overwhelmingly, it's been shown that there is no necessarily negative side effect to children if women are on the biologic when they're pregnant and breastfeeding thus far. There's another observational trial that's working to predict the biological response in patients. So this means like what biologic might be best for you. So should you start on Humira, or should you start on Stelara, or should you start on Remicade? They all have different mechanisms of action, and this is trying to get a little bit more precise, that idea of precision medicine. Another study that's running, why do some siblings get autoimmune diseases but others don't? And again, these are nothing invasive. There's no medicine that's being given to patients. It's really just observational. And so they might have patients journaling, taking notes. You might be giving blood, but no treatment's being given. And then finally, another one that's running is how hip replacements impact sexual function. And so they're looking into that. And so again, a very wide array of options. Moving down, a Fitbit study. Does exercise help arthritis? So everyone who participates gets a Fitbit, and that gets tracked and sent to the study team, and they keep an eye on symptoms. Treating fatigue and morning symptoms in lupus. So that one is interesting because it's actually, I think, a drug that a lot of us know very well, which is prednisone. And that's looking at the difference between a delayed release prednisone versus an immediate release prednisone. And so everybody's getting a treatment, but it's just a little bit, whether it's delayed or immediate. And finally, one that's comparing Humira versus Humira and methotrexate in psoriasis. And so again, everybody's getting a treatment, and I think that Humira and methotrexate tend to be pretty well-known drugs in the autoimmune disease space. And it's this idea of trying to understand, should patients be on simply Humira, or is methotrexate important because is it helping prevent building up antibodies? So those are just a couple of examples of clinical trials, and to help you get a little bit more comfortable with the concept of them and the different types that are running. And so I think we can advance to the next slide to keep rocking. Okay. So, and we talked about this a little bit already when I was going through the trials, but there are two different types of trials when you are looking at clinical trials from a whole perspective. So there's interventional trials. And so this is where patients can get access to new treatments that are not yet available via standard care. So this is, you're actually going to be getting, there's an intervention. You're getting some sort of treatment. And you can also test new ways of using existing treatments. And so again, that's this idea of, okay, we've tested the bioelectric stimulator in rheumatoid arthritis patients. Now let's try it in lupus patients. Or we've tested Humira and it's approved for Crohn's patients and arthritis patients, but now we want to go into clinical trials for it with lupus. And so sometimes there can be biologics that are already approved for other indications, or medicines that are already approved for other indications that go into clinical trials for another disease. And then observational trials are a lot of the examples I just gave. So this is allowing researchers to follow up patients' health to learn more about the condition. And generally patients are able to continue on their current course of treatment if they are taking anything. And it's mostly, wear this Fitbit and track your steps, or write a diary of your symptoms, giving blood work, perhaps doing some, an MRI or getting some testing done. And so those are the two different types of trials. We can move to the next slide. Okay, so there are a series of phases that clinical trials will go through before they actually reach approval. And so there's 4 phases. The first phase of clinical trials is generally a few months. It's usually a small cohort of participants, and these are typically healthy volunteers. And so that means that they are not living necessarily with any sort of condition, because at this point they want to test what the tolerable dose is, and then the safety. So to make sure there's no really severe safety risks. And again, that's a pretty small trial, small group of people, and it's not only going to last a couple months. Then we're going to move into phase 2. Phase 2 generally is going to run about 2 years. It's going to be bigger than phase 1, but still not as big as phase 3 in terms of the number of participants. This is a point where we are going to bring patients in who are living with this condition. And now, because we've already tested dose and safety, we're going to start looking into treatment efficacy. Of course, we're still monitoring dose and safety, but we want to really find out, okay, is this treatment going to work? By the time we hit phase 3, that's going to be many years. It's going to involve a lot more participants. And this is where you're going to see the treatment being put against, this treatment that's in testing being put against the current standard of care. So let's say we were talking about rheumatoid arthritis for a clinical trial. The current standard of care might be considered methotrexate or a steroid or a biologic. And so half the patients in the trial might get that current treatment, whether that be methotrexate, something already approved, and then half might get the new treatment. So everybody's getting some sort of treatment. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then finally, after phase 3 is when a drug would actually, or a treatment would be brought to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And at that point, they would make the decision to say, yes, we'd like to approve this drug, or no, it does not get approved. Phase 4 happens after a drug has been approved. So that's where they're looking at the safety and the quality over time. They're checking for adverse events in the long term. And those are typically observational because they're just, monitoring patients who are on those therapies. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Safety and other concerns. Again, this is the big thing that we often hear about. I think that in my work, so many people say, oh, well, I don't want to be a guinea pig. And I understand that. I get that. But clinical trials have changed drastically over the past couple decades. And there are so many regulations in place to ensure the safety of clinical trial participants. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I'd like to address some of the common myths. So we can go to the next slide. How placebos are used. This is one of the things that I hear the most. People say, oh, but I don't want the sugar pill. I don't want to be on a placebo. What's interesting is that a lot of clinical trials now, just like I was talking about that standard of care in the phase 3 trial, a lot of clinical trials don't actually use a placebo, meaning you're not getting any treatment. A lot of clinical trials, what they're doing is they have that new treatment that they're testing, but they also have half the patients getting that current standard of care. So everybody's getting some form of treatment. Now, if it is absolutely necessary to the trial design that patients, do have to get a placebo that doesn't necessarily have any treatment. Typically, the way that they'll design it is that half the cohort will get the treatment, the new treatment. And if it's found that after a certain amount of time that's working, everybody in the trial gets switched over to that new treatment. And often we'll get expanded access after the trial ends. If it's working well for them, we'll get the expanded access so they can continue on with it. And so that's just something, and that's, it does vary trial to trial. So you need to look into that. And the study team, when you're applying for trials, they can help you understand what the design of the trial looks like. You will be fully aware. Nobody is going to lie to you and tell you that you're getting treatment if you're not. So, there's a process called informed consent. So you have to fully understand everything about that trial before you actually sign on to it. So there's full transparency that's happening. Another common myth we hear about is that all trials test newly developed treatments. And a lot of trials test newly developed treatments, but actually a lot of them are testing, as I mentioned before, medications that have already been approved by the FDA, but they're looking to approve them in a new condition. So some of the biologics that are often used for autoimmune diseases and currently on the market are a great example of that. Humira started, I don't remember which one it started with. It might have been psoriasis. And then, they went in for Crohn's disease. Same with Stelara. They started with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis, and then they went and got it approved for IBD. And I believe we have a couple of biologics in the pipeline now. One of the new ones coming is for lupus, one of the new indications. And so it's interesting because you sort of have the luxury of already knowing, okay, this drug has been proven to be safe and effective by the FDA. Now they're just trying to test it in my condition. And so that can make you feel a little bit more security. And so that's something important to know. And then finally, that only drugs are tested in new trials. And that's actually not true. So sometimes they're testing like that nerve stimulator I mentioned before, a medical device, something like a diabetes a pump, or perhaps they're testing a surgery. So there are all different types of trials, and it's not necessarily just some sort of pill or injection that would be tested in a clinical trial. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, which is all about clinical trial safety and regulation. And there's so much to say on this topic, and I think it's really important. And so I've actually included a guide that we've developed in collaboration with a IBD physician, Dr. Peter Higgins, and it really gives you a very clear outline of how clinical trials are regulated for safety, and I've included a few of the highlights here. So clinical trials are actually the last step in a 10 to 15 year research process to develop a new treatment for a condition. So before it's getting into the human trials, it spent a lot of time in the lab. It's been tested on animals. It's been tested, in petri dishes. They've been doing a lot of work on this for quite a while. And then the Food and Drug Administration is a federal institution that protects participants throughout the clinical trial process by working closely with researchers to make sure the clinical trials are safe. And so they have to go through, every company that wants to go into a clinical trial, they have to spend a lot of time talking back and forth with the FDA to make sure that everything is good to go and that it's going to be safe for participants. Same with these IRBs, or what's known as institutional review boards. Those are necessary for every single clinical trial. Everybody has to have their own institutional review board. And those are made up of a group of professionals with a diverse experience in research, medicine, ethics. And they review and approve all clinical trials, all aspects of the clinical trial. Everything from the marketing to the design of the trial. They're looking at all of that and making sure that it's safe for the participants. And then finally, there are state, national, and international regulations and policies in place to protect the rights and safety of people during and before they're even enrolled in the clinical trial. And when I say before they're even enrolled in the clinical trial, that's why we're talking about this informed consent process. So that patients sit down with a member of the study team and they really go through the nitty-gritty details of what is going to be involved in participating in this clinical trial. And so there's a lot of checkpoints in place and checks and balances to make sure that these clinical trials are as safe as possible for the participants who are entering into them. And Katie, I believe it's over to you for a quick break.
Before I get into our description of Arnett, Laura, is there any questions out there for us?
Kitty, yes, it looks like we have one question come in so far, and it's this. I live in Iowa and have two very uncommon autoimmune conditions. How can I learn more about what trials are available in my area?
That's such a great question. And I am going to get a little bit more into that towards the end of our presentation about some of the resources out there for searching for clinical trials. But two of the big resources I will recommend are clinicaltrials.gov and then the work that we're doing at Clara Health. And so I'm going to, if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to answer that question when we get to the next part of our presentation.
Sounds good. Okay, so here at AARDA, one of the projects that we work on is the Autoimmune Research Network, or Arnett for short. For you, the patient, it is a simple survey. You input all your information, and then we try to take that information, compile it so that researchers can find connections, find links, spark ideas of what to look further into to find those breakthroughs in autoimmune disease research. And also, from time to time, we will get contacted by people looking to do clinical trials or in-depth research or specific disease research. And the participants who self-select with those diseases, we will contact them and let them know of that opportunity. So if you'd like to participate, it's on our website, and again, we'll be sending it to you. It's arda.org/arnett, and again, just by filling out a simple survey, you can help power autoimmune disease research. And now, back to Lily.
Yeah, the Arnett is such an important, it's so important for autoimmune patients to be aware of, and something that I really encourage everyone listening to participate in and spread the word about, because it really doesn't take long to sign up. And this is how we are going to push research forward. This is how we are going to identify, parallels between different diseases and really push forward and develop new treatments. And so I really encourage you to look into that. I am a member of the Arnett Network. Okay, so let's see, what do we got next? Participation. So I think this is going to answer some of the questions that we've already had come in. Let's move on to the next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about why a patient would consider participating in a clinical trial. So there's a lot of different reasons. This is that you want to, perhaps it's that you want to understand all of your treatment options available. I really believe as a patient advocate that it is critical that you know every option that is in front of you. And that can mean the approved options, but that could also mean clinical trials. If you're concerned about, let's say, for example, again, you're a rheumatoid arthritis patient, and maybe you've tried methotrexate, maybe you've tried a few biologics, and maybe you're like, I don't really want to do another biologic. Perhaps your body doesn't respond well to them. Perhaps you are building, side effects. And I am not hating on biologics here. I'm on one myself, and it's done wonders for me, but I'm just using it as an example. And perhaps now about this bioelectric stimulator, and you say, I really would like to try that because I think that could make a big difference. It could be something different for me that, maybe has less side effects. And so it's just important to understand those options. You don't have to go with them, but to know that they're there. Perhaps you've tried and failed a few different therapies for a condition and you want to try something new. Maybe you're experiencing side effects that are just unbearable from the medication that you're on and want to see some more options. Now, this one is unfortunately something that we come across a lot, is that if you can't afford to cover the cost of your care, or you're struggling with getting insurance coverage, we all know that, some of the step therapy stuff has been a real nightmare for so many autoimmune patients, where you're having to try and fail different medications before you get to the one that works, or your insurance refuses to cover the medication your doctor wants you on, or you have a ridiculously high copay. One of the big benefits of clinical trials is that often the treatment is covered by the trial sponsor. And so it can offer you free care. And that's not a panacea. That doesn't count for every single trial, but it does for many of them. The majority, I would say, actually are covering the cost of treatment and care going into the facilities. And also, sometimes they're even giving travel stipends to help cover, the time that you're taking or the amount of money it takes to get to and from a hospital. Perhaps you've exhausted all of your approved treatment options, so you've literally been through every single one you could possibly ever try. And this is it. Clinical trials could be really like the last resort option for you. Perhaps you're interested in finding a co-therapy that could complement your current treatment. So, maybe you are on some sort of medication that's overall working really well, but you're still experiencing some other, perhaps side effects, or it hasn't gotten rid of all your symptoms. Perhaps there's a co-therapy that you might be able to find through a clinical trial, and you can stay on your current treatment. And then really, from this altruistic point of view, you want to help advance research about the condition and help other patients down the line. And so, by participating in a clinical trial, you really are making a difference for so many patients now and in the future. If you think about it, every single medicine that we currently have, that so many of us are on, wouldn't exist without the patients who participated in clinical trials. And that's really remarkable. That's a really remarkable thing to consider. So those are just some of the reasons that a patient might consider participating in a clinical trial. And I think Katie was going to speak a little bit more to that and the power of clinical trial participation. Katie, are you still there? I think you might be on mute.
Sorry about that slight technical difficulty. But yes, so the power and impact of clinical trials is amazing. It's not just the individual person getting that treatment. It has a ripple effect for the entire autoimmune disease community, for even beyond the autoimmune disease community, all patients who are looking for new treatments, different treatments, breakthroughs. So the power of clinical trials really is not to be underestimated.
Thanks, Katie. So as we look at how to navigate the process, and I hope this will help answer the question earlier, and I will say that I'm happy to answer questions personally beyond and after, so we'll have the AARDA team share my information with anyone who might like support, additional support after the webinar. But how to navigate the process. So it's always great to talk to your physician about this and getting their feedback, getting their input. There are many physicians who do keep up with clinical trials that are happening in the space, but some of them don't always have the time. And so here is where you have an opportunity to be your own advocate and look into it yourself and say, hey, I want to take a peek at what options could be out there for me. And so clinicaltrials.gov is one place where you can go, or Clara Health. And selfishly, I'm going to point you in the direction of Clara Health. But I say that because we actually do list everything that's on clinicaltrials.gov, but we do it in a lot more user-friendly way, and we have support staff who can help you. And then also, I highly encourage you to participate in Arnett and with AARDA, because they can absolutely help connect you with opportunities, and they're a great sounding board for support in the research and clinical trials space. So those are a couple of different places that you can go to start the process of getting more information about clinical trials. And we also have, Clara, we have developed guides to clinical trials. So everything from what it's like to participate in a clinical trial, to safety regulations, to how placebos work. All of that is in our guides, and that's guides.clarahealth.com. And so clinical trials, can we advance to the next slide, please? How Clara can help. And so, this is sort of what we do all day, every day at Clara. So if you come onto our site, it's absolutely always free of charge to patients and caregivers. you can run your own search. You plug in all your information. So you plug in, female versus male, your age, where you are located, how far you're willing to travel, and what conditions you have, and then it will filter down trials that could be a fit for you. And if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by that, you can actually call, email, or instant message our trial navigators. We're always on standby, and we can help customize options that best fit your needs, and we can help give you a list that you can bring to your doctor to discuss. We'll actually even go ahead and we're going to coordinate care directly, so we can get you set up for what's called a pre-screen. Typically, you'll need to go into the hospital site or clinic site where the clinical trial would be taking place to see if you are a fit for that trial, and we can help coordinate that. We can help coordinate your travel. We work with Uber. We can order you an Uber. So there's a lot of different things that we can do, and again, that's free of charge to patients and caregivers to help make this process easier for you. And so please feel free to get in touch with us anytime, and we're more than happy to be of help. And so I hope that this has been a informative webinar for you, and we can advance to the next slide because I'm happy to take any questions at this point. But it's just so critical that all of us understand, as autoimmune patients and caregivers and healthcare professionals in the space, the importance of clinical trials. And I encourage you to share and spread the word about this knowledge that you've learned, because that's how we're going to fill these trials, and that's ultimately how we're going to expedite the pathway to new treatments and cures for other patients. And so having this knowledge it's very important. And so I'm going to turn it over for any questions that anyone might have.
And while everyone is submitting their questions, if you want to hear more from Lilly, she is very generously going to be speaking at our LA Walk this upcoming weekend. We're super excited to have her there. And you can also follow her on Twitter. She is one of my favorite, things to pop up on the feed. She's always posting amazing stuff when it comes to patient advocacy and all the different goings on in the patient advocacy world.
Oh, thank you so much, Katie.
And we'll have all those links, her Twitter handle, Clara Health, again, sent you in the next couple days.
This is Laura. While we're waiting on some questions to come in, Lilly, would you spend a few minutes just sharing your story and how you wound up in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was diagnosed at the age of 19 with back-to-back over the course of 6 months with 2 autoimmune diseases, and they had a very severe onset. So I had psoriatic arthritis so severe that I wasn't able to walk, and it was over my entire body. And then 6 months later, I was hospitalized with bleeding ulcers in my small intestine, and it was at that point that I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And so it was unbelievable to me because I had never heard the term autoimmune disease before in my life. And I was Googling, psoriatic arthritis and Crohn's disease. And that's how I figured out it was autoimmune diseases, that's what I had. Nobody said it. And from that moment on, I had decided, really from the moment I was in the hospital bed, that I wanted to help other patients, because it upset me that there are 50 million Americans who are living with an autoimmune disease, but I had never even heard the term. I mean, 50 million Americans, that's twice as many as cancer. And we all know someone who has cancer. And then there's a great empathy for that. And I think that we really need to begin to have that same sort of empathy for people living with autoimmune diseases. And so that was how I got involved in the space and really dedicated my time to advocacy and working with AARDA, and then bridging the gap between patients and industry. So working on the industry side with pharma companies, and then with Clara Health to help give patients access to these resources.
Thank you, Lilly.
Sure.
It looks like we have a question that came through. I have pemphigus foliaceus. Do you have trials for that?
It's a great question. So I believe we do have some trials for pemphigus. I would need to check the specifics on that, but we'd be happy to share. We're going to share my information, and an email can be sent to me directly, and we will actually pull trials that could be a fit for you in your area, because we would want to make sure that they're not too far away from you as well.
Thank you. And another question, do you have trials for celiac disease?
Yes, so there are definitely some trials happening for celiac disease. We're seeing an increase in that space, and again, I'm happy to, for anyone who is interested to know if there are trials for their condition, because there are a lot happening in the autoimmune space. What we can do is you can reach out to us directly, and actually if you even go to clarahealth.com, you can chat us right there, and it'll be my face that pops up. But spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you a little secret. It's not always me who's responding, but it is me whose whose face will pop up, and we can help you figure that out. And what we'll actually do is, not only will we tell you if there are trials happening, but we're going to want to make sure that you're fit for them. So, and that you have some in your area, because sometimes there are trials happening, but they might not be close to you. So we would want to make sure that there's something that's within a reasonable distance to you.
Thank you, Lily. The last question is whether or not we can, or that they can share this on various websites. And I will say yes, we have a recording that we will send to everyone that was on or registered for this. And we encourage you to share with anyone that may be interested in clinical trials.
Hi, Lily, this is Sandra.
Hey, Sandra.
I got a question for you, maybe two.
Okay.
With your years of experience, one, do you see an increasing number of people interested in clinical trials and participating in clinical trials, say over the last 5 years?
Yes, I think that's a great question, and I think that we certainly have seen an increase in interest, and I think part of that is because we're doing a better job demystifying clinical trials, and we have some amazing patient advocates who exist. And if you aren't, for those of you who are not aware of the patient advocates that exist online, I encourage you to check them out, because there are really some incredible people who are sharing their stories via blogs and via social media, who are helping raise awareness about clinical trials that are happening. And as more and more come into the space, I definitely think there's been more participation. However, unfortunately, and this number is alarming, about 85% of clinical trials still fall behind because they're not, and they don't have enough participants. And so every day that those trials are open, millions of dollars are being lost, and it's just more and more time that the treatment isn't getting into the hands of patients.
That is alarming. Okay, so my second question might kind of tie into that. Has it been your experience that you've had more of a challenge with any particular group of people, population of people that are interested in participating in clinical trials? I know in certain groups there's mistrust with the medical field. And so clinical trials can be pretty scary to them, based even on historical practices, things that have actually taken place. So have you found there's a particular group that's harder to reach?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, unfortunately, a very sad truth in the history of clinical trials. And so we have historically, there's been a very hard time enrolling minorities in clinical trials, which is a really big issue, because there are the way that people respond to medicines between sexes, between races, can be very different. And so it tends to be that a lot of white men end up being in clinical trials, and there is definitely a lack of diversity, which again is a problem, because what you administer to a female or somebody of a different race outside, Hispanic or African American. It's all different. And so it's really important that we have that participation in clinical trials. And there's been a big push by industry to try to make that happen. And, you're exactly right, Sandra, that there's been a bad history, unfortunately, with where people have been mistreated, especially, people of, in diverse populations who have been mistreated. There's things like Tuskegee and other really terrible events in our history. And what, though, we need to remember is that there have been so many because of those really terrible events that took place and, on to humans. There's actually so many regulations in place now to prevent something like that from happening. And so what we all need to do is we need to foster this idea that you can trust your healthcare team, and that there are regulations in place to prevent something like that from happening. And it's really not even just one checkpoint. There are so many checkpoints to make sure that that participants are being kept safe and everything is being done by the book and appropriately. And so I think that that's something, though, that all of us need to work together to focus on a lot more.
Mm-hmm. And it'd probably be good to even put that out there in advance, because for some people that's in the back of their mind, and for us to acknowledge, we realize that's there, that's a reality for you. We're not ignoring it or minimizing it, right?
Yeah.
Or hiding it. But I love your response about the checkpoints.
Yeah.
I don't think the average person realizes that.
You're 1000% right, which is why we need to keep pushing to raise awareness. And we're actually also it's interesting that you bring this up too, because we're going to be releasing a podcast in the next couple of weeks on our Patients Have Power podcast that's actually about an MS group, which MS is of course considered an autoimmune disease, that's running a diversity in clinical trials initiative. And we got into some of these conversations about this idea of the mistrust that currently exists in the healthcare system, especially with minority populations, and how that impacts clinical trial participation and why we need to begin to turn the tide on that. And so that will be, maybe we can link to that in the show notes as well, or the webinar notes, but that's another thing that we have coming up. And it's certainly something that at Clara, we've been talking about, trying to have more discussions around, because it is really important. And I do know that industry is making a push for this as well. So, it's good that we can be encouraged by that. But when push comes to shove, I think there's only so much that industry can do. And it's up to us as advocates and as patients to help spread the word, because I think that there's nothing more powerful than hearing from a peer and talking to a peer who has been through something. And so for all of you attendees who are listening, you really hold the power to begin changing this landscape. And so I really encourage you to, have conversations with fellow patients, and not even just patients, to the general public, because, so many of us beyond, yes, those of us who have chronic conditions really need clinical trials, but Advil had to go through clinical trials. Tums had to go through clinical trials. There's a lot of these over-the-counter medicines that we use that have been through clinical trials. And so it impacts all of us, whether you're living with a chronic condition or not. And that's really important to keep in mind.
And I wanted to ask something, Lilly. Has there been a particular clinical trial that kind of stuck out to you as maybe being the most unique or even fun?
Oh, that's a great question. So some of the ones that I pulled earlier were, that I had kind of mentioned earlier, were some of my favorites. And I'm just trying to think about if there's one, though, that has really stuck out. I have to tell you, we've come across some really interesting ones. And, I'm going to say this is a little taboo, but whatever, it's a clinical trial, so I'm going to share it. We talked about it on our podcast once. There have been clinical trials that look into orgasms and orgasms in, you know, men and women. And I mean, that's the type of, it really, when I say that clinical trials span the gamut, they span the gamut. And so looking into all of these different, really different areas of the, you know, the human body. And so I think that it's really interesting to keep that in mind, and to, you know, be open to looking into different ways that you can contribute to research. But I think, I'm just trying to think if there's another fun one. I will tell you, I'm very encouraged by, and I think that this is important for especially those listening who have an autoimmune disease or caring for a loved one with an autoimmune disease. I'm very encouraged by everything in the pipeline. There is a lot coming out for people living with autoimmune diseases. And, you know, what's exciting for us is that so many of these treatments treat multiple conditions. And for every treatment that's coming down the line for arthritis or IBD, I know that that's going to end up having a lot more indications and helping a lot more people. And especially this idea of, like, you know, that vagus nerve stimulator, right? This idea that, you know, it's a medical device. It's not even necessarily like a biologic therapy. And that could be a total game changer. I don't know for sure. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a medical professional, but in my eyes, that's a total game changer for people living with autoimmune diseases. And so I am encouraged by all this. The other thing that I'll say is I'm starting to see more in diet in autoimmune diseases, which is really exciting. There's some trials currently running for patients living with Crohn's disease that are looking at the difference between the specific carbohydrate diet and the Mediterranean diet. There are clinical trials that are looking into supplements and the impact of vitamin D on autoimmune diseases. And so not only are we looking at these therapies, but we're looking at some supplements that could be beneficial, diet that could be beneficial. So there's a lot of hope. If there's anything to take away from clinical trials, is that there's a lot of hope for people with autoimmune diseases. And, you know, I encourage you to keep an eye on that research, because who knows, it might be something that ends up being the treatment that works for you.
And that is a perfect note to end on. There's always hope. There might not be a cure yet, but there's always hope. So it looks like there are no more questions. Oh, wait, we might have one more question.
Thank you. We do have one more question. Have you seen research for vitamin D3 therapy?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a bit of research happening for vitamin D therapy, and I'm not sure about which trials are which indications are currently running for vitamin D3, but I know we have an article on our website that talks about the impact of, you know, from a previous clinical trial that talks about the impact of vitamin D3 on people living with IBD. And so there has been some research already conducted on it and clinical trials conducted on it. And I think there might be a couple that are running now, and I would be happy to look into that for any specific therapeutic area, if anyone, or condition, if anyone would like that support. Oh, and that's the other thing. I'm sorry, I'll say one more thing, just, you know, for those who are interested, if you are interested in seeing results from past clinical trials, if you do go to clinicaltrials.gov, they do have a tab where you can look at past research and you can see what the results were from clinical trials. They don't always post it there, but you can search online to see results of, you know, and what happened in clinical trials. Usually that information is public. So if you are interested in looking into past research that's happened, you can do so.
That's fantastic. I just want to thank you so much, Lilly, for spending this time with us and giving us so much information. A lot of it has been even new to some of us here at AARDA. So we are so grateful. And once again, Lilly will be speaking at our autoimmune walk this coming weekend. And if you're interested in our autoimmune walks, even holding a virtual walk, you can find more information about those at www.autoimmunewalk.org. And then we will be having another webinar coming up in December. It will be featuring Dr. Rose. He is considered the father of autoimmunology. He has been with AARDA, I believe, since the start. He has pioneered a lot of autoimmune disease research. So we go from Lilly to Rose. So I hope you can join us. Again, that's going to be December 15th. And again, check your inboxes in the coming days because all the content will be in there, including everything Lilly mentioned, her Twitter handle, her podcast, her website with Clara Health, and all of our AARDA links as well. So thank you for coming and have a good afternoon.
Thank you all so much for having me. Please feel free to reach out anytime.
So our next webinar is December 13th, Thursday, December 13th, just to be clear. Again, thank you all and have a great night.